Time is a flat circle. That's right. It's not linear. It doesn't move forward. There's no such thing as the future, and all of human history happens simultaneously. So says the Mayan creation myth. But that doesn't mean time is static. In fact, the ancient Maya were pretty keen on controlling it, and their efforts in that regard are the reason we have calendars today. Well, that and humanity's oldest war. Calendars have been around for thousands of years, but for most of that time they've been incredibly complicated and difficult to use, a fact which has not changed. It's not easy being a human trying to keep track of time. While Earth rotates on its axis once every 24 hours, which provides us with day and night, it also travels around the sun every 365 days, give or take. The problem is there's nothing particularly notable about either of those intervals. We don't actually know why our bodies run on a 24-hour day. It's just what they do. And if you look up at the sky, the stars appear to move in such a way that it's almost impossible to calculate how long a year really is. These complications didn't stop our hunter-gatherer ancestors from making observations. However, as early as 15,000 years ago, humans were tracking solstices, and those times of the year when the sun shines most directly into the center of the sky. At noon and the length of day and night are roughly equal, or they're extreme opposites, because they occur at roughly predictable times every year. These astronomical events made it possible to count days, weeks, months, and eventually years. And since the beginning of agriculture depended on knowing when it was the best time to plant crops, you can bet this kind of knowledge was valuable. But it was until the invention of writing about 5,000 years ago that humans could start to record these astronomical observations systematically and pass them down from one generation to the next. As far as we can tell, the earliest calendars consisted of two parts: an annual calendar based on the solar cycle and a lunar calendar based on the phases of the moon. This shouldn't be surprising. Both the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians developed sophisticated calendars based on the cycles of the Nile River flooding and the phases of the moon respectively, though because both of these cultures developed their calendars independently, they didn't exactly line up. The Egyptian calendar, for instance, had 12 months, each corresponding to a constellation in the zodiac, while the Mesopotamian calendar had 13 months, keeping track of the phases of the moon. Now, here's where things get tricky. Not only did neither of these calendars have a reliable system for counting days, but they couldn't even agree on how many days were in a year. The Egyptian calendar was solar-based, so it assumed that a year was 365 days long. Meanwhile, the Mesopotamian calendar was lunar-based and kept track of the phases of the moon. As anyone who has ever had a cat will tell you, the phases of the moon aren't tied to anything as regular as the solar cycle. So, a lunar calendar year is closer to 354 days long. This discrepancy didn't cause too many problems at first, though. For most of human history, people haven't really needed to coordinate their calendars. If you wanted to see the Oracle of Delphi, you just went to her whenever it was convenient. But as trade routes expanded and kingdoms grew, coordinating more and more people, calendars became less of a luxury and more of a necessity. Enter King Sargon of Akkad, who reigned over Mesopotamia in the 23rd century BC. Sargon is considered the first true emperor because he ruled over a massive empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. So his court needed a good way to coordinate with everyone. He declared the first month of the year to be in the month of Nisan, aka Aviv in the Bible. The problem is that Nisan is on the first month of the year in the tropical or astronomical sense, which is when the Earth reaches the vernal equinox, which corresponds to the constellation Aries, hence the name Aries. Instead, Nisan falls between March and April. This error may seem small, but it adds up over time. Eventually, the Julian calendar, which was introduced by Julius Caesar in the 1st century BC, took the vernal equinox as its starting point. But until then, the seasons were all out of whack. Summer might have begun in the middle of May, but people still celebrated in the same way every July. Still, these calendars weren't all that different from our own. They counted days like we do now. They had months that lined up with the seasons. They even had leap years. So what makes them so difficult to use? Well, one problem was that they didn't have a watch or a phone to check the time. So, telling the date required some effort. Then there is the fact that most of the world didn't have a printing press until the 15th century. So written calendars were expensive to produce and hard to distribute. These issues obviously prevented most people from keeping track of the date without the help of religious authorities. That's one of the reasons why early Christianity rejected the idea of a calendar. When Jesus Christ came along, the region around the Mediterranean was ruled by the Roman Empire. The Romans under whose influence the Julian calendar was developed, viewed the first month of the year as March. But Jesus was born in September. Or was it August? Nobody can quite agree. The point is that determining Jesus' birthday was a matter of intense debate. Eventually, the church settled on December 25th, a date that was probably chosen to coincide with pagan holidays like Saturnalia and the winter solstice. That way, pagans would be more likely to convert to Christianity if they didn't have to give up anything. But because of this contentious issue, Christians avoided keeping track of dates for as long as they could. They didn't establish any official calendar until the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century AD. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church decided to stop celebrating January, April, May, June, July, and August. That's right, those months didn't exist for 600 years. The church was already peeved at pagans for influencing the official calendar so much that they got rid of the entire concept of months altogether. Instead, the church kept track of days in terms of weeks and days of the week, which, yes, are also derived from paganism. Meanwhile, the Islamic calendar completely rejected the notion of following seasonal cycles. In fact, it doesn't even attempt to line up with the solar cycle at all. The Islamic calendar is a purely lunar calendar based on the phases of the moon. A lunar year consists of 12 lunar months, and a lunar month begins at the sighting of the new moon. This is also true of the Hebrew calendar. In fact, the Hebrew and Islamic calendars are very similar because they were both influenced by the Nabatean calendar. The Nabateans were an Arab people who lived in modern-day Jordan and controlled the trade routes for myrrh, an ingredient in Bethlehem's famous Star of Wonder. They needed a calendar to keep track of when caravans should arrive at the port city, and they were happy to lend their expertise to their neighbors. In fact, it wasn't until 1881 that the United States officially recognized the Gregorian calendar, which is the version of the Julian calendar adjusted by Pope Gregory VIII in 1582. Before then, colonists relied on almanacs, which were published annually to provide information about weather, planting, tides, astronomy. etc. Almanacs could come from England, France, Spain, or the colonies themselves. This led to widespread confusion, since these various almanacs used different calendars. Imagine you're about to board a ship to England to meet your sweetheart, but you receive word that she arrive at the appointed time in a month. Are you waiting for December or September? But after the American Revolutionary War, the United States was finally able to set its own rules. At the urging of an astronomer named Simon Newcomb, the Continental Congress passed a resolution establishing the Gregorian calendar as the official calendar of the United States. The measure passed easily in the Senate, but it had to be amended in the House of Representatives to exclude any mention of the Pope. After all, this was a new nation founded on the principle of separating church and state. But while Congress argued over whose calendar was more godly, the British were burning down Washington, D.C., and the delegates had bigger fish to fry. Today, the Gregorian calendar is the most widely accepted civil calendar in the world. However, because the Gregorian calendar assumes that the Earth goes around the Sun every 365.242 days, it needs to add a leap second from time to time. Some countries like Iran and Nepal use their own unique calendars, while others like China use a hybrid system. Chinese New Year follows the lunisolar calendar, which means that the first month of the year begins with the new moon that occurs closest to the vernal equinox. And of course, we haven't even mentioned the Mayan calendar, which predicted the end of the world in 2012. The ancient Maya created their own calendar system which predicted eclipses and helped them keep track of agricultural cycles. Unfortunately, much of their system was destroyed during the Spanish conquest of the Americas. But in recent years, amateur astronomers have worked to reconstruct it. As you can tell, it's surprisingly difficult to keep track of time. But without calendars, we wouldn't know what day it is, let alone what year it is. And for that we should all be very thankful. Unless you're a Mayan, in which case, sorry, we gave your calendar to the gods. You won't find many documentaries that go into the origin story of something as everyday as the calendar. But that's just one of the many fascinating topics that are covered in Wondrium's catalogue of incredible documentaries. Their course, How Do We Know What We Know, will teach you how science works by walking you through experiments and examples. You'll explore perception, memory, statistics, and even social psychology. So whether you want to know how political decisions are made or how memories can be Wondrium has a documentary that can teach you.